Okay, we have a good number in here. Thanks everyone again for joining us for today's autumn 2021 Michael Davis e-lecture. We hope to continue seeing you all online and hopefully in person in the 2022 lecture series. In a moment, today's moderator, Chaz Director and GFAP Co-Faculty Director and Crown Family School Professor, Jean Marsh, will offer brief opening remarks and an introduction of today's presenter, Janelle Goodwill, PhD, Neubauer Family Assistant Professor at the University of Chicago's Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. If you have any questions, please type the questions into the Zoom Q&A pane for answering. The chat function will be open later in the presentation for questions following the entire slideshow. We will do our best to answer questions in the order that they're received, following a discussion, deep dive on the topic with Drs. Goodwill and Marsh. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Chaz website, chaz.uchicago.edu, as well as on the Chaz YouTube channel that is found by searching for the Center for Health Administration Studies. And now, Professor Jean Marsh will introduce today's presenter.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Michael Davis Lecture Series. It's my great pleasure today to not only welcome you, but to introduce our speaker, Janelle Goodwill, who is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor at the Crown Family School, the University of Chicago. Janelle was appointed the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor after a very competitive process where she was chosen among a group of assistant professors to receive this honor of being a Neubauer Family Professor. She came to Chicago in 2020 and has been a strong contributor despite COVID and the other various challenges of her first year at Chicago. Janelle and I share something in terms of our academic trajectory. Like Janelle received her bachelor's in psychology from Michigan State University. Then she went on to the University of Michigan, where she received her master's in social work and continued on for her PhD in the joint program in psychology and social work. This trajectory of go green, go blue, go maroon is the same one that I followed many years before. And I don't know about you, Janelle, but I was very pleased on Saturday when go green prevailed over go blue. I always cheer for MSU during football season. So Janelle has, as I said, been a great contributor in her first year at Chicago, and her research centers on the mental health experiences of Black Americans, with a particular focus on suicide and depression. In this work, she explores how strengths like help-seeking, coping, and social support protect against adverse outcomes and ultimately promote well-being. Today, she'll speak with us about suicide among Black youth, centering priorities for intervention and prevention. Thanks, Janelle.
Thank you so much, Professor Marsh, for that wonderful introduction and for our Spartan connection. I too was very happy with the outcome of this weekend's game. I'm not sure if some of my Michigan Wolverine friends and family are on the call, but if so, they'll be all right. So thank you so much for the invitation and for the warm welcome and introduction. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to speak with you all today, particularly considering that I'm new and just moved here during the pandemic. I'm excited to be able to share some of my work, both previous work and also some new research that I've done since joining the faculty in July of 2020. Okay, so first I'll begin by providing an overview of what we'll spend our time together this afternoon doing. So I'll begin by describing some of the national trends in suicide among Black youth and young adults. From there, I'll discuss my previous research, go over some of the findings from some of my previous related work. From there, I'll discuss some preliminary findings from a new study that I'm doing that focuses on suicide here in Chicago. And then I'll end by presenting information around next steps and some ideas that I have for plans to move this body of research forward. Now, before I get into today's talk, it's important for me to, again, remind viewers that I will be discussing some very difficult and sensitive material today in my presentation. I recognize that the University of Chicago is a place that does not support trigger warnings, but I believe that it's important when describing something as important as suicide prevention to, again, remind viewers that I encourage you to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself during this time. It would not take a gifted statistician to know that there are likely many of us on the call who have some sort of personal connection to this topic. So again, I encourage you to attend to whatever concerns come up for you during this time, but to also take care of yourself during this presentation. Okay, so that being said, I'll now transition into sharing information that describes some of the national trends that we see currently among Black children and youth. So in reviewing data from the CDC's Whiskers study from 2019, we see that suicide is the second leading cause of death among 10 to 34-year-olds across all race groups in the US. Suicide is actually the third leading cause of death among Black females ages 15 to 24. And suicide is also the third leading cause of death among Black males ages 15 to 34. Now, within that, it's important for us to assess some of the within group age differences that have emerged in recent years. Now, a particularly concerning feature of this work really lies in the disparities that we see among young children in particular. So for example, Ariel Sheftal and colleagues analyzed data from the CDC's National Violent Death Reporting System and found that from 2003 to 2012, Black children ages 5 to 11 were more likely to die by suicide when compared to children of other race groups. Now, additional analysis of CDC Whiskers data found that between 1993 and 2012, there was a significant increase in suicide among Black boys who were younger than 12 years old, though the total number during this time of suicides decreased among white boys during the same time period. Moreover, the rate of suicide among Black children ages 13 and younger was found to be 2 times greater when compared to their white peers. Again, this finding was focusing specifically on children ages 13 and younger. Now, with each of these studies, it's important to note that these researchers analyzed data from national reporting systems. So this was not specific to one particular region or population, but they analyzed death records from national data in the CDC and other federal sources. So since then, other scholars have examined trends among Black youth that are older and found that really the number of suicide attempts has significantly increased among Black high school students since 2003. Even still, an analysis of death records reveals that Black youth are less likely to report an attempt before they actually die by suicide. And most recently, researchers have confirmed that the total number of suicides among Black teen girls has increased since 2003. Now, this finding is particularly meaningful because historically, Black boys and men have been more likely to die by suicide. These data, though, just generated and published in 2021, indicate that this gap between Black male youth and Black female youth suicides is actually narrowing. Now, a natural next question would be to consider why young Black people are dying by suicide. And in researching this question, scholars have begun to assess precipitating or contributing factors that were reported among youth who later died by suicide. In doing so, these researchers found that issues like relational conflict with others, whether that be boyfriend, girlfriends, friends, or family members, actually led to a greater risk for suicide. Additionally, younger Black children under age 15 who experience isolation or bullying in school were more likely to die by suicide. Moreover, we see that among a sample of youth who died by suicide, Black youth were more likely to have previously experienced probation or parole when compared to youth from other race groups. Now, additional factors like diagnoses is really important to consider. So among older Black youth, factors like depression or dysthymia were prevalent, whereas among younger Black children, those under age 14, diagnoses of ADD or ADHD were actually present among those who died by suicide. Substance use is another factor to consider. We see that young people have turned to substances like marijuana in particular to cope with some of the challenges that they face before their death. And then lastly, previous history of suicidality. So by that, I mean that having a previous suicide plan or attempt does increase one's risk for later dying by suicide. And among those factors, we see that Black girls in particular are reporting more planning and previous attempts when compared to Black boys. Now, alongside these advances in research, there's also been a push to prioritize Black youth suicide prevention among policymakers and Congress. For example, Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman partnered with Professor Michael Lindsay, who's a professor at NYU's Silver School of Social Work, to create an emergency task force that focuses specifically on suicide prevention among Black youth in the US. This task force is comprised of researchers, clinicians, organization leaders, pastors, and policymakers in Washington who are all working together to raise awareness around this important topic. So in December 2019, the task force published a report titled "Ring the Alarm" that details the current state of suicide among Black youth and provides really much needed insight into this complicated and complex occurrence among youth in the US today. You can review this report by following the link that's listed at the bottom of the screen. It's publicly available and available for your review at any time. Now, the publication of this Ring the Alarm report is particularly meaningful because it was instrumental in encouraging the National Institutes of Health to dedicate funding to interventions that address suicide prevention among Black youth. Here's a screenshot of a notice of special interest that describes the scope of projects that would be considered by this funding mechanism. This issue was published just last year on June 16th, 2020. Now, it's important to consider the fact that there is now federal funding in dollars in support of Black youth suicide prevention because this is not a new phenomenon. By that, I mean that Black youth suicide prevention is not a new occurrence in research. It's recently received a lot of attention and now really considered more of a hot topic in research, but we've seen patterns and trends that have been concerning, particularly among this population, for decades. So I really believe that in order for us to move this body of research forward, we really do first need to look back and honor the contributions and carefully review what Black scholars have written about since the 1980s. So for instance, this is the MMR Weekly. This is published by the CDC. And here the title of this article says that suicide among Black youth has really increased between 1980 and 1995. This was published by the CDC more than 20 years ago in 1998 and really raises concerns around the increase in suicides at that time, particularly among young Black males. Now, as I mentioned, this was published in 1998, but we can go back even further and see contributions of scholars who talked about this same topic many years ago. So earlier considerations really do point to the fact that there were Black scholars who warned us about this increase in Black youth suicide dating back to the 1980s. Since this time, the gap between Black and white youth suicides narrowed. So initially in research dating back to the 1980s, there were trends that show that white youth were at greater risk for suicide, but that gap between the two races did narrow during this time frame. It is, however, important to note that suicide was initially recognized as the third leading cause of death among Black males in particular, as early as 1986. So when we're considering that the notice of special interest from the National Institutes of Health came in 2020, it's important to keep in context and keep in mind that the first citing or the first mention of this concerning trend happened and was published in 1986. Now with that, I draw from a particular scholar whose work has been helpful in my thinking around this. Her name is Janelle Taylor Gibbs. She is now an emeritus professor at University of California, Berkeley's School of Social Welfare. But you can see that from these screenshots that she has published previously on this very important topic around Black youth suicide. So this first article speaks to conceptual, methodological, and sociocultural issues when really addressing suicide in Black youth. But then the second article also addresses some sex differences in suicidal behavior among Black youth. Now, what I want to point your attention to are the dates of these articles. You'll see that this paper was published in Suicidal Life-Threatening Behavior. For those that don't know, that journal is really considered like the landmark journal of the suicide research world. It's the publication that comes from the American Association of Suicidology. But this paper was published in 1988. Another paper was published in Journal of Adolescence Research, again, another respected journal that receives a lot of attention, and that paper was published in 1989. So I bring this to your attention just to, again, reiterate that this topic of Black youth suicide prevention is not new, and there are scholars well before me who came and addressed these issues in their work. Now, I particularly take to Janelle Taylor Gibbs and respect her work because she is a Black woman social work scholar who really was a leader in this field, but did not receive a ton of resources or recognition for her work in Black youth suicide prevention. I mean, among her accomplishments, she was the first Black faculty member across the entire University of California system to be honored with an endowed professorship. And so I bring this up and I share the dates because it leads me to really think about what could have been or what work could have been done if maybe Professor Gibbs received funding back in the 1980s to develop a community-based or school-based, evidence-based suicide prevention intervention for Black youth. Perhaps we would already have a lot of the answers to the questions that we're raising today, more than 20 years later. Even still, I think it's important to recognize the gains that have been made since then. So I don't want to leave you all with the sense that all is bleak and that there have not been any improvements. That's not the case at all. There's been some significant gains in this world of suicide research, particularly among youth. So really, there have been some effective interventions that have been identified to reduce suicide among youth broadly, okay? But many of these interventions are actually designed for hospital or psychiatric settings. So some of the most effective interventions that have been recognized or seen really do center around youth who go to an emergency room or go to a psychiatric hospital unit when experiencing a crisis. We know that people of color, particularly Black Americans, do not have the same access to these sorts of psychiatric hospital settings. So we then would understand why Black youth would be underrepresented in these research studies. There's also been some gains made in the world of suicide, school-based suicide prevention interventions. However, it's important to note that a lot of the school-based suicide prevention interventions have been offered at the high school level and not necessarily for middle and elementary school students. So there's still some existing gaps. There have not been enough culturally tailored suicide prevention interventions that have been offered to Black youth. There's such a need and there's so much more room to really consider tailoring, adapting, or just designing entirely new interventions that meet some of the unique needs that Black youth experience throughout their time in adolescence. There is a scholar and researcher here in Chicago, Lavone Robinson, who's had successful funding applications from NIMH, actually implemented among high school students here in Chicago. And so that's work that I definitely look to as well, but there's still such a need for more work in this area. As mentioned previously, there's been a few resources made available to elementary and middle school students. I'll share some data later towards the end of the presentation that really speak to the experiences of younger people in Chicago that would make us, I think again about making these resources available at a younger age. I really believe that waiting until high school to have conversations around suicide prevention is not the best approach, and that it really could be important and helpful for us to begin providing suicide prevention intervention information available earlier. Okay, so now that I've provided you with an overview of what research currently looks like among suicide among Black youth, I'll now transition to talking about some of my research. As I mentioned, I just joined the faculty in July 2020, so I thought it'd be helpful if I just shared some of the findings from some of my previous research that's relevant to suicide among Black Americans. So in my career, I've used a number of different data sources. So the first data source that I spent a lot of time with came from the Young Black Men, Masculinities, and Mental Health Project. Principal investigator is my advisor in graduate school, Dr. Daphne Watkins. And this intervention really aims to meet the unique mental health needs of 18 to 30-year-old Black men. I've also done some analysis with the National Survey of American Life that's led by the late James Jackson at the University of Michigan and comes out of the Institute for Social Research and the Program for Research on Black Americans. The NSAL is a very important data set because it's one of the few data sources that's publicly available and includes a probability sample of Black Americans in the US. In my dissertation, I use Healthy Minds data. So this comes from the Healthy Minds study, initially led by Daniel Eisenberg, who was at the University of Michigan, but now is at UCLA. The Healthy Minds study is one of the largest studies that focuses on college student mental health. And then lastly, I've begun to focus more on using existing data made available through the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So in my dissertation, I used data sources 1 and 3. I used data from the YB Men Project and also from the Healthy Mind study. And since then, I have begun to analyze nationally representative probability samples from the NSAL and the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So I'll walk you through a few of those now. So I'm looking at some of my dissertation findings from the Healthy Mind study. I found that when considering and examining odds of suicide attempt across different race groups, we found some differences that I think are pretty compelling. So I published a study in 2020 with my colleague, Sasha Zoe, and in this study, we analyzed survey responses from 653,000 college students. And so this is obviously a very large study. It's not longitudinal. This is a cross-sectional data source. We analyzed survey responses that were collected from 2007 to 2018. Because of that, we had a lot of racial group variety in this study. So in this study, we found that, interestingly enough, Asian international students and Black or African-American students reported the greatest odds of attempting suicide in the past year when compared to white college students of their same age. Some of my additional work that focuses specifically on Black college students really sought to explore which coping strategies moderate the relationship between depression and suicidal ideation. Now, in this study, I did a lot of psychometric work, which I'm not going to spend time going into today. But in this study, one of the main findings was that religious coping strategies moderated this relation between depression and suicidal ideation. So I'll explain this figure to you now. So to the right of the screen, we have religious coping measured at -1 standard deviation below the mean, at the mean level, and then 1 standard deviation above the mean. So we could think about this as low, average, and high religious coping strategies. So on this x-axis, we see that depression score is measured from 0 to 24, whereas the probability of suicidal ideation, we could think of this as a percentage. So among the religious coping strategy different levels, we see that those who report utilizing more religious coping strategies, even when depression increases, the probability of suicide is not increasing. However, when we're looking at students who are reporting average or low levels of religious coping, that probability of suicidal ideation is increasing significantly. So we can see that there's quite a bit gap between young people who utilize very low levels of religious coping relative to those who use moderate levels of religious coping. So again, this is a quantitative study. I think it's answers important questions for me, but also leads me to even more questions around which specific factors of religious coping are most salient for young people. In this particular study, the religious coping items included things like praying and seeking God for insight. But I think that there's a lot more that we could learn about young people's religious coping strategies in the face of experiencing suicidal thoughts. When analyzing data from the National Survey of American Life, I published a study in 2019 with my mentors, Daphne Watkins and Robert Taylor, that was published in Archives of Suicide Research. And in this study, we analyzed survey responses from a probability sample of over 1,200 Black men in the US. Here, I was interested in looking at the relationship between everyday racial discrimination, depressive symptoms, and suicidal ideation. And so here I found that there are positive associations between each of these variables. So we can understand this as experiences of everyday racial discrimination were positively associated with depressive symptoms, and then depressive symptoms was positively associated with suicidal ideation. Additionally, there's a direct relationship here between everyday racial discrimination and suicidal ideation. So essentially, this finding is important because it's telling us that everyday racial discrimination is an item that isn't addressing these sort of really overt or extreme forms of discrimination, but instead they're the daily insights and insults that impact an individual's well-being over time. And so here it's important to note that everyday racial discrimination was positively associated with both depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation. Okay, now when assessing data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, I was interested in looking at the relationship between feelings of worthlessness, parent relationships, and suicide risk among Black youth. So this study was just published earlier this year in Journal of Adolescent Health. Sample included a little over 2,900 Black youth ages 12 to 17. So note here that the red and bolded text represents statistically significant odds ratios. So here, when measuring which covariates were positively associated with past year suicidal ideation, we see that being prescribed for a mood disorder was positively associated with past year suicidal ideation, along with fights with parents and feelings of worthlessness. However, receiving verbal affirmation from parents was negatively associated with past year suicidal ideation. So I think this is a particularly compelling finding in the sense that there's 12 to 17-year-old young people who believe that their lives are worthless and feel worthless, but receiving verbal affirmation from parents is still negatively associated with less suicidal ideation. We're looking at the relationship between these covariates and suicide attempt. We see that both hospitalization and receiving a prescription for a mood disorder in the past 12 months were positively associated with attempt, whereas fights with parents and worthlessness were still positively associated with suicide attempt. So I think these findings really do point to the need to really design interventions that reach young people and their parents. We know that the youth that are in schools or in the communities that we live in and work with are not living in isolation, that they live with parents, with family members, with grandparents, aunts and uncles, extended family. And so really being able to speak to the needs of both students, young people, and parents will be helpful. It also raises concerns around providing additional support for young people who have previously been hospitalized or who have been diagnosed with a mood disorder previously. Now, continuing some data analysis that I've done from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, I've recently collaborated with a colleague in the School of Social Work, SUI, and here we analyzed survey responses among 7,704 youth across all races who previously attempted suicide. We were interested in learning more about their involvement with school, community, and religious activities. So I won't go through each of the items or all of the findings here just for time's sake, but I will point out some things that I think are particularly interesting or compelling in this work. So when asked the question, did you receive emotional treatment from a therapist in the past year? Again, this is among a sample of young people who all have attempted suicide. They have each of these young people have reported previously attempting suicide in their life. We see that each of the race groups is presented here on the x-axis, and then the y-axis includes the percentage. We see that among Black youth, 32.69 reported that they had received emotional treatment from a therapist in the past year, versus only 28.95% of Asian youth reported that they received treatment from a therapist in the past year. This difference was not statistically significant, but it is important to note that both Black and Asian youth were less likely to report receiving emotional treatment when compared to all the other race groups. When moving on to comparing the percentages reported by Black versus Latino and Latina youth, we see that Black youth were still less likely to receive emotional treatment from a therapist when compared to this group, along with multiracial students, Native American and Alaskan Native students. The t-test or the chi-square test between Black youth and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander youth was not significant. But I think this finding is particularly important when comparing the experiences of Black youth and white youth who all previously attempted suicide. So we would understand this as, while 32.69% of Black youth who previously attempted suicide received treatment from a therapist in the past year, 51.33% of white youth who attempted suicide received emotional treatment from a therapist in the past year. And this difference is statistically significant. So I think it's important for us to know and think about and really wrestle with these issues of access in terms of who's receiving access, particularly after experiencing a suicide attempt and who's not. Findings from this nationally representative probability sample do indicate that Black and Asian youth are reporting the lowest levels of receiving treatment from a therapist. But again, it still speaks to the importance of considering where these resources are located. And I think it does point to opportunities to really consider using schools as a great way to reach young people who are experiencing psychological distress and mental health concerns. Additional findings from this same study speak to the role of religion among young people who've attempted suicide. So when asked the question, when asked to report how much they agreed with the statement, "My religious beliefs are very important to me," I think it's worthwhile to note that among the strongly disagree, 27% of white youth reported that they strongly disagreed, that their religious beliefs were very important to them. That's a higher percentage than any other race group in the entire sample. However, when looking at those who reported strongly agree, we see that nearly 40% of Black youth who previously attempted suicide stated that their religious beliefs are very important to them. So this is compelling, I think, for a few different reasons, in the sense that we could consider, are there any existing suicide prevention interventions that include information about religion, or have any concepts or tenets that include concepts that may be salient to Black youth's religious views. Another view of this is really thinking about the ways that religious institutions could be used as places to reach people who are suicidal, particularly young folks. Okay, so now that I have shared an overview of some of my research related to suicide, I'll now transition into an area where I want to spend a good amount of time, and that's reviewing some of the suicide trends in Chicago. So in this portion of the presentation, I'm introducing you to a new research study that I'm leading that has a local perspective on addressing the issue of suicide here in Cook County. Now, as I mentioned, I moved to Chicago in 2020. I joined the faculty here in July. And so as I was transitioning from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Chicago, I began to see news stories about this spike in suicides among Black Chicago residents, as presented in the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Defender, and even the Chicago Tribune. So this screenshot is from an article that was published in the Chicago Sun-Times in July of 2020. And here we see that the tagline says that midway through the year, the number of suicides among Black Americans has already matched the total for all of 2019. Now, unfortunately, that number continued to rise, because by the time February 19th of 2021 rolled around, we see that there's been an increase in suicides among Black Chicago residents that's larger than has been in any other year over a decade. So as someone who studies these topics and is deeply concerned about the well-being of Black people and their mental health and their mental health experiences, I was naturally drawn to really do a deeper dive and an analysis of this work. And so I really use this work by journalists as a launching board, as a launching pad to begin to explore some of the trends that I just was struggling to understand. And so in this work, I build upon what's already been mentioned here, but do a deeper analysis in the work and trying to identify some patterns that may be surprising to some of you, and certainly do have implications for the work that we carry out, both in the Crown Family School of Social Work, but amongst the university in general. So when you look at the total number of suicides in Cook County from 2015 to 2020, you see that the most suicides occurred in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Okay, so this is a typical figure that you could generate just using data from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Archive. That's where the data that I'm analyzing come from, and also where the journalist data come from as well. So when we look at this figure, we see that, okay, the suicides in 2020 in particular have decreased. That's, I think, a general assertion that someone could take away when reviewing the data as they are when they come from the Medical Examiner's Archive. However, I think it's important here to do a within group analysis and to look at trends amongst people within specific race groups to see if this pattern still holds. Now, it's important to note that when looking at the suicides by race from 2015 to 2020, white Americans make up the most suicides in Cook County. This is not surprising considering that they're the largest population of residents here in the county. We also see that Black, Latino, and Latina residents, also Asian residents, are also presented here in the medical examiner's archive data. However, when we begin to assess within group differences, we begin to see some different patterns that I think are compelling and should really implore us to begin considering how we can best serve those who are experiencing some serious mental health concerns around us. So when we're looking at suicides among Asian Cook County residents only, we see that the most suicides occurred in 2019, but then decreased in 2020. Even still, there's been an overall trend that increases since 2015 among Asian Cook County residents. When we analyze the data specifically among Black residents, we see that there's been a pretty steady increase since 2015, but 2020 in particular, the number of suicides almost doubled among Black Cook County residents when compared to previous years. When looking at the data among Latino and Latina residents, we see that again, 2019 was a particularly concerning year, but that there was a decrease in 2020. And when analyzing the data among white Cook County residents, we see that since 2015, there's been a pretty steady decline in suicides among this group. So I think something that we can see in terms of trends and questions really does assert that while the number of suicides among white Cook County residents has decreased since 2015, we do see a pretty steady increase among Asian, among Black, and even among Latino and Latina residents that's reported more suicides in the past 5 years. Now within this, it's also important to assess sex differences. So here we see that among Asian residents, Asian males make up about 70% of the suicides. Among Black residents, Black males make up 77% of the suicides. Among Latino and Latina residents, again, Latinos make up 75.94% of the suicides. And we see also similar numbers among white residents as well. Now, when looking at these data, I think it leads us to question what trends do we see, but also which race groups are missing. So I'll go back to this slide here, where we see that particularly males are making up most of the suicides across each of the race groups. This is pretty consistent with what we see, not even just in the US, but across different countries. In most countries, we do see that men are dying by suicide more than women. However, there are some exceptions in terms of countries, particularly in Asia, like Japan, where their women do comprise most of the suicides relative to men. Even here, I think it's also important to note that I'm able to assess sex differences only based off of the medical examiner's archive data. There's not information about gender identity presented, so I'm only able to assess the sex group differences here in this analysis. Even still, I want to point you to and encourage you to think about which race groups are missing, okay? So I'll go back a slide here. And so here we have information about Asian Cook County residents, Black Cook County residents, Latino and Latina Cook County residents, and also white Cook County residents, okay? Now, this is helpful information for us to know, and it's great that we're able to dig deeper into assessing within group differences, but it's still missing information on some race groups, particularly when we're thinking about the experiences of Native American and Alaska Native youth. Now, folks in the research world, in suicide research particularly, would recognize that this is important because Native American youth report some of the greatest rates and highest rates of suicide when compared to other race groups. But it seems that there's this misclassification or misidentification of Native Americans in the medical examiner's archive data set. Additionally, I think that there's definitely concerns and misrepresentation of those who identify as multiracial. There was not a specific group that comprises the multiracial residents of Cook County in the medical examiner's archive data set, but it does point us again to some important implications for this work moving forward. Okay, so when thinking about the trends that we see along with the race groups that are missing, I think it's also important for us to assess some age group differences. Now, again, this is pointing back to the very beginning of the presentation where I shared information about young Black people, in particular children, experiencing some really concerning increases in suicide in recent years. So now I'm going to walk you through some age group differences among each of the race groups. So I'm looking at Asian Cook County residents. Among females, we see that the greatest proportion of suicides occurred among those who were 26 to 34 years old. However, when we're looking at the experiences of Asian males, we see that those 35 to 44 experienced the greatest proportion of suicides. When assessing the experiences of Black Cook County residents, we see that among Black females, those 45 to 54 represented the greatest proportion of suicides. Now, this is particularly unique in the sense that that's a group that we just don't hear much about. I think a lot of the conversations right now around suicide prevention among Black Americans really is youth focused. And there has not been a ton of work that's focused on the experiences of middle-aged Black women. The 26 to 34-year-old group then follows, representing 20.20%. Among Black males, again, it's this 26 to 34-year-old age group that represents the greatest proportion of suicides. And I want to particularly call your attention to this age group, this 8 to 11 years old age group. These are the youngest residents of Cook County who died by suicide. 8 to 11-year-old Black males who at that very young age have opted to end their lives. And so since 2015, there's been 4 suicides among Black males in Chicago, ages 8 to 11. When assessing the experiences of Latino and Latina Cook County residents, we see that among Latinas, it's this 35 to 44-year-old age group that's representing the greatest proportion of suicides, followed by the 18 to 25-year-olds. But then we're looking at the experiences of Latinos, we see that it's the 18 to 25-year-old group again that's representing the greatest proportion. And again, we see this really concerning trend where there are 2 suicides by 8 to 11-year-old Latinos in Cook County since 2015. Then lastly, when looking at the experiences of white Cook County residents who died by suicide, we see that among white females, this age group from 45 to 64 is reporting the greatest proportion of suicide, relative to white males who are representing the greatest proportion between the 55 to 64-year-old age group. So I know that there's a lot of information and a lot of numbers, but here I'm really trying to assess and dig deep into seeing what some of these age group trends are. Because right now, as I showed you previously, NIH is really focusing on reaching those 12 to 17 years old. That's really important. That's necessary, and we need that. Even I've submitted a grant under that notice of special interest, and I'm hopeful that that work will be funded. However, these findings show me that when looking at the experiences and the needs of our neighbors, the people here in Cook County, our friends and family members, that really the suicide prevention work must go beyond reaching youth, that we really need to be reaching those who are 18 to 25, 26 to 34, but particularly those who are also middle-aged and later in life. I think qualitatively, it's an important question to consider why are young people of color particularly choosing to end their lives when they're young versus white Cook County residents who are opting for suicide later in life. I think it's certainly qualitative questions that need deeper exploration. And these preliminary findings from data that come from the medical examiner's office just provide some early insight that can certainly be a guide in the work that I do moving forward. Okay, so now I will just share some additional information about suicide method by sex and race group. And so here we see that among Asian females, hanging or suffocation is the most common method that's used. Among Asian males, it's again the hanging and suffocation method that's used most often. Among Black females, it's been hanging and suffocation, but also opioid use. Among Black males, we see that more than 50% of the suicides occurred using a gunshot wound, which is different than what we see with the other trends. Among Latinas, it's again hanging and suffocation. Among Latinos, it's the hanging and suffocation. That's the greatest proportion, followed by gunshot wound. Among white females, we see, again, hanging and suffocation, followed by opioid use. And then when comparing the experiences of white males, we see a nearly even split between hanging and suffocation and gunshot wound. So with each of these figures, here we see that hanging and suffocation really is a common method that people across different race groups are using when they're planning to end their life. And that can really point, I think, researchers and clinicians and interventionists to designing resources and programs that reach people and provide this sort of preventative information before they get to this point. I think it's also compelling that we see gunshot wounds being used primarily among males, particularly Black and Latino males. Now with this, I think that there are still certainly several remaining questions and considerations that I'm wrestling with in my work. So again, I am concerned about the issues regarding the classification of race groups by the medical examiner's office. So there's the undercounting of Native American and Alaskan Native suicide. There's no options for the Middle Eastern and North African populations. And also the multiracial groups are also overlooked or undercounted. And so this is something that I think really must be taken up and moving forward when trying to design culturally tailored suicide prevention interventions for our neighbors and members of this Cook County community. Now, a similar problem arises when trying to link existing data with population estimates from the US Census. We know that there are issues with the census and lots of pushback against some of the race groups that are listed in the census. And so I'll share more about this later, but when trying to link these county level data with data from the census to generate population estimates, it can become difficult to do if there's not consistent representation of the race groups. Also, it's unclear what factors drive these age group differences within and across race and sex groups. And lastly, I'm wrestling with, as many people are, I'm wrestling with this question about why suicides increased among Black Chicagoans, but decreased among all other groups during 2020. We clearly know that 2020 was a particularly difficult, painful, and sorrowful year where many of us experienced serious loss, serious threats to our health, well-being, psychological distress, job insecurity. There are so many things, the list could go on. Unexpected grief among many things, but I think qualitatively, there's more work that's needed to be able to describe what some of these differences that we are seeing emerge in data from Cook County. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I will share just some next steps and ideas that I have for this work moving forward. So what I shared today with you from the Chicago data is just descriptive statistics, nothing particularly advanced, but my next steps are to merge population estimates so that I can do a more rigorous analysis and actually generate some incidence rate ratios so that we can see if the rates are statistically significant across race, age, and sex groups. I'm also in the process of doing a qualitative and mixed method study that will provide, I think, additional insight and answer some of the questions that I'm raising. So I have a new project that's actually undergoing IRB consideration right now, and I'm hopeful that it will be approved soon so that I can begin interviewing folks who have a history of suicide attempts, but ultimately are now in a place where they can offer insight and encouragement to others. I believe that the findings from this study really do point to the need for early intervention, particularly when reaching elementary school students. So I'm not sure if you remember, but earlier in the presentation, I mentioned how, although there's been some great gains in the context of making suicide prevention resources available in schools, most of those interventions are offered at the high school level, not at the middle and elementary school level. But when considering that we're seeing young people, very, very young children dying by suicide, it does, I think, speak to a need to really provide those resources early and to build a culture of prevention beginning in childhood. And then lastly, I'm really wrestling with and thinking through how to best intervene and serve working adults. So when trying to reach children or youth, you can think about a school being a great system or structure to reach people and to offer a universal intervention. A universal intervention is an intervention that's made available to everybody, not just those at high risk. And so I think that could be a great option for preventative measures. However, I think it can be difficult when trying to decide how to best reach the most amount of working adults who are not in school, who may be working or may not be working, but are not always in the same exact place. And so I'm struggling to think about how to best reach the 26 to 34-year-olds or the 44 to 55-year-olds. I think those are questions that I'm really wrestling with now and talking through with my collaborators. Okay, so I'll end by discussing just some implications from the work. So first, I really believe that these findings show that the analysis of the within group differences is really required to promote suicide prevention in meaningful ways and salient ways for the residents of Chicago. You know, if I had just left the analysis at the first histogram that showed that the suicides in Chicago decreased, and if I hadn't done that within group analysis, then I wouldn't have learned that the suicides increased among Black Chicago residents in 2020, but decreased in every other group. I think it's also important for us to really keep an eye towards the youngest members of our community. I think it is particularly compelling that the youngest suicides among 8 to 11-year-olds occurred among Latino and Black boys. We cannot ignore that. And I think it really is speaking to a particular need that is necessary for us to address within those particular populations. When reviewing these findings, I also am compelled to consider gun violence as a suicide prevention priority. When considering that 53% of the Black males who died by suicide in Cook County used a gun, that's higher and greater than any other race or sex group. It does, I think, help me and encourage me to reframe this issue around gun violence from being solely about homicide, and instead points to some really important considerations for suicide prevention as well. And then lastly, there's, I think, a need to offer a deeper assessment of access to local mental health resources. So right now I'm in the process of mapping the different suicides that have occurred across the city, and I'm looking to see if there's concentration of suicides in different neighborhoods, particularly on the south and west sides, particularly where folks from underrepresented groups reside in the city. So I look forward to being able to really do more work in that area and to really assess what some of these neighborhood differences may be moving forward. So that's all that I have for you today. Thank you all so much for your attention. I appreciate you joining me this afternoon. I'm happy to take questions at this time.
So thank you very much, Janelle. That was a wonderful presentation and extremely informative. We have already on the Q&A some questions here. The first comes from Daniel Fabriki, who says, I'm curious if the stigma of suicide has been reducing in the Black community. If so, can that explain some of the trends reported at the beginning of the talk? I assume reduced stigma would be a good thing for outcomes, but is that correct? And please keep your questions coming. We have a great large crowd out there with great interest in this, and let's keep the questions coming. Go ahead, Janelle.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So if you were able to join today, and I appreciate your question. Stigma is certainly, I think, an important factor. And the study that I mentioned with the college students found that those who endorsed public stigma, so the idea that most people have negative views about folks who are experiencing mental illness, or most people would be ashamed of seeking mental health treatment, those items were actually positively associated with suicidal ideas, suicidal plans, and suicide attempts. So among the Black sample in that study, but also across other race groups, we saw that perceived public stigma was associated with greater odds of suicidality. So we could think about that as meaning that the folks who really need the most help, the ones who are reporting suicide, I think are the ones who are really endorsing the most stigmatized beliefs. And so I think within these conversations about stigma among particular race groups or sex groups, I think sometimes there's not a deep enough focus on considering public stigma versus personal forms of stigma. And so I think that those factors could have different influences on the outcomes. So I think particularly among Black Americans, sure, stigma is an incredibly important issue, but I think the same could be said among Asian Cook County residents, that there's strong cultural ties and expectations that would prevent people from seeking help. And I think the same thing among men in particular, we've seen that as well. So stigma is certainly important and it's a factor here, but it wasn't included, in this medical examiner's data set, but it's something I'm thinking about moving forward for sure.
Thank you. And from Adriana Jennings, does the religious data show which religions they belong to?
No, that's actually a limitation that I've written in the discussion section. So hopefully that paper, is accepted soon. But yeah, that's one of the challenges of doing secondary data analysis, that we unfortunately, don't have any control over what items are included. We can just analyze what's there. So yes, your question is so important because that study does not include specific information about the religious identities that the young people hold. It just more so says that and ask them if the religion is important to them. So yes, but being able to pinpoint that and drill deeper into specific religious identities would certainly be important for moving forward.
So we hear from Franzana Shabda. How much does the role of systemic racism and historical trauma play in the rates of suicide among Black youth?
Well, I think it plays an incredibly important role. I mean, when I ended on the last slide, when thinking about access to mental health resources, that is a function of structural racism. When we look throughout the different Chicago neighborhoods and we consider where Black Chicago residents have been forced to live throughout the decades, and when we consider which resources are made available, we consider the closing of county mental health resources, I think that those all speak to issues of structural racism. We consider which schools have funding for mental health resources, or which schools even have funding to have a school-based mental health resource center. Those are all functions, I think, of structural racism. And so I think it's so incredibly important. I mean, the study that I mentioned from the National Survey of American Life focused on everyday interpersonal forms of racism, but we know that the structural racism is so important here. I will say existing data sets don't always have great measures and great functions of racism, but I think right now the field is really pushing myself and others to really carefully consider some of these structural forms of racism that impact people's ability to have access and resources to suicide prevention programs.
That's great. Thank you. And from Allison Paulson, one of your slides listed known risk factors for suicide among Black teens, relationship trouble, school, etc. I was wondering whether the research on the youngest kids, the 5 to 11-year-olds, has found any risk factors for that group.
Yep. So on that slide, Allison, there was information that was specific to Black teens and those younger as well. So on that slide, I was pulling data from studies by Ariel Sheftal. If you're interested, I would definitely encourage you to go look up her work. Ariel Sheftal and Jeffrey Bridge at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, I think, have done probably the most important work that we've seen around suicide prevention with young people. So with young Black Americans, and by that I mean particularly children. So again, I want to reiterate that suicide among Black youth is not a new phenomenon, but their team at Nationwide Children's Hospital has been so important in raising issues and seeing these trends among Black children, those younger than 12 or 13. So some of the precipitating or contributing factors that were listed there among the youngest children were their school problems, isolation and bullying. Also among the kids that they analyzed using CDC data, they've seen that the diagnosis of ADHD and ADD have also been contributing factors as well.
Thank you. And Kyla Fike asks, thank you for an amazing talk, Dr. Goodwill. This work and your perspective is so needed. Can you talk a little bit about how you'd like to see teachers or social workers in schools be able to support youth of color around suicide prevention?
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Fike, one of my fellow Wolverines who maybe wasn't happy about the outcome of this weekend's game. But yes, I think that the role of teachers and social workers, but also families, is so important in this work. I think some of the work that we've seen, and even I think what other scholars are calling for, is really a multi-level approach. So the NIH grant that I showed, that Notice of Special Issue, is calling for multi-level suicide prevention interventions that really do really focus on the strengths that are currently within these networks that Black youth are in, and really just seek to enhance what's already there. So I think in context of teachers and social workers in particular, I think that the solution may not be for someone like myself or someone who's like not even connected to the schools to just show up and begin doing suicide prevention interventions. I think it's instead making resources available to teachers and to social workers through funding and through training and access to be able to just bolster the work that they're already doing. So, you know, I believe that there are teachers who are probably already providing individual support, but that's just not sustainable. I think there really needs to be a structural mandate, a structural sort of resources made available at the school level that really can provide the sort of comprehensive and holistic support that young people need. So that would mean having school-based mental health centers. There's a handful of school-based mental health centers in Chicago and in Cook County, but we have seen these sort of upstream interventions have some really effective results in reducing suicides among kids who attend schools that actually have mental health resources available and centers available in the school. So, so I think it goes beyond having just one social worker in the school. I think there really would need to be a comprehensive center that focuses on health, behavioral and physical health in terms of providing supports to teachers and parents and social workers, because oftentimes teachers may not know what to do, may have questions, and same thing with parents. Parents, you can imagine that a parent who recently learned that their child, their 9 or 10-year-old is suicidal, may not know what to do. I mean, that is alarming and frightening. And so being able to have folks who are specialized and trained in this in schools, I think could be a really beneficial plan for moving forward and addressing suicide prevention at multiple levels.
Great, thank you. And I have to say that Kyla Fike has forgiven us, Janelle, both for the beginning of the introduction. And now we have another one-time Wolverine, Harold Pollack, who says, "Thank you for the fascinating, albeit disturbing talk. How should we think about ambivalence in cases where people might not have clear suicidal intentions, but engage in behaviors where they appear, at least in some way, open to that possibility? Some of our opioid overdoses in which individuals inject alone may fit that profile. Other individuals who have violent confrontations with police or others may also fit this category."
Yes, thanks, Harold, for attending and raising this important question. I think that what could be helpful here is what I mentioned earlier around the universal intervention. So earlier I mentioned this in the context of schools, and that universal intervention could be helpful because it's reaching and designed for the entire class and not just students who are at high risk. I think the same thing could be beneficial in terms of offering the same thing for adults who may have an opioid use disorder, that offering a universal intervention for those who are currently at high risk for drug use but may not currently be suicidal could be really effective and important, I think, in trying to essentially kill two birds with one stone. That if there are existing drug treatment programs that also offer comprehensive mental health and suicide prevention specific information, I think that could be one avenue forward in trying to reach people, because we know that people are complex, they have comorbid disorders, and it's really just when someone chooses to end their life, it's never just one thing, or rarely is it just one factor that's contributing to that. So I would suggest the universal suicide prevention interventions could be, an optimistic or hopeful consideration and plan for moving forward.
So Janelle, I want to jump in with a question I have. Given the data you have on religion and religiosity and the protective aspects of that, is there a role for our churches, and particularly work at the University of Chicago on the Black church? Is there anything particular that we should be thinking about?
Yes, that's something that I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about. We know that Black Americans are generally very religious, that particularly when compared to other race groups, Black folks really do identify as religious. And, Professor Marsh, I know we've talked about and considered some of the significant contributions of folks like Robert Taylor and Linda Chatters in this role of religion in Black Americans as social work scholars. And so I certainly see opportunities and really, I think, promising avenues for considering religious institutions as places where people can receive suicide prevention interventions. and thinking about how a lot of times religion can provide someone with a sense of life purpose and meaning, then perhaps an individual will choose, even in the face of hopelessness or chaos or difficulty, perhaps even then they will choose to keep living because they know that their life has meaning. And so I will say, this is, not new. I'm not the first person to think of this. There's a researcher at George Washington, Sherry Malak, who is a psychologist and a minister. She actually wrote a paper on suicide, life-threatening behavior, I think in 2006, about designing a suicide prevention intervention for Black youth in churches. The intervention, I think, was not carried out, but it was more of a vignette process that walked researchers through how they could think about this. I'll also mention that the report that I showed from Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman, the Ring the Alarm report, one of the people that's on that task force is a pastor here in Chicago, Reverend Otis Moss, who pastors a church on the South Side. So I don't know him, but I've just—
You should get to know him.
Apparently, yeah, but I was happy to see that he was a part of it. And I think that there are certainly— I think the data are just compelling. When you think about an 8-year-old child choosing to end their life, I think the data are compelling enough that even people who feel deeply uncomfortable with this topic cannot deny that there's such a need, and that churches could be a good place to reach parents and children.
Great, thank you very much. And now from Kenora Maxwell, do you have any information regarding the usefulness of light therapy as an intervention to help a young person diagnosed with depression?
I don't have information on that, and I'm unfortunately unable to speak to that, but certainly interested in learning more. So if you have something, you could please email me, but I don't have that information myself.
Okay, thank you. And one more comment. Great job, Dr. Goodwill. Do we have any other questions? Then let me say another big thank you, Janelle, for a really great presentation, very informative, and something that we all need to be thinking about as social workers and as researchers. I appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for
All right.
having me.
Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you next Tuesday for the Michael Davis lecture with Alita Burris. Take care. Goodbye.